Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm excited to spend the next couple of hours with you as we start talking about the MS-100 exam about identity and services within Microsoft 365. For this session, we're first going to talk about the exam itself, a little bit of an overview. So we'll do a review of MS-100 first, kind of what that means, and then we'll break down into the smaller section. So we'll talk about Microsoft 365 services, understanding user identity and roles, understanding access and authentication, and then the last area in the exam, we'll talk about Office 365 workloads and applications. So let's first talk about the exam itself. And I suppose the very first question I always like to ask is the exam for me or for you? Well, the MS-100 is designed to test your technical knowledge and practice when implementing a Microsoft 365 tenant. Now, you may have seen other exams where they're more kind of just theory and whether you understand something. This one will obviously give you real world questions and things to understand and what the technical implications of doing something will be. To take the exam, you need to have taken one of the prerequisite exams if you want to flow all the way through to becoming the expert on the right hand side, which is the Microsoft 365 Certified Enterprise Administrator Expert. That was a mouthful. You need to have taken one of the prerequisite ones, which is one of the associate exams, which is either Modern Desktop Administrator Associate, Teamwork Administrator Associate, Security Administrator Associate, Messaging Administrator Associate, and Teams Administrator Associate, or have the MCSE Productivity Solutions Expert exam. That prerequisite combined with MS-100, also, which then gets combined with MS-101, will then give you that magic title of an Enterprise Administrator Expert. So whether you're working towards that or whether you're just wanting to validate the skills that you have, just be aware that by taking MS-100 and then moving into MS-101 and any of these, you'll actually move towards that certification. So what are the skills and topics that are measured in the exam? Well, at a high level, the MS-100 exam measures 4 skills, each with several topics that you should know about. So each of those are broken down into smaller segments, and there's a certain percentage of the exam that's allocated to those topics. So the first one here is we have design and implement Microsoft 365 services. So this skill is 25 to 30% of the exam and includes understanding and knowing how to set up a Microsoft 365 tenant, as well as monitoring the health of all the services and the tenant in general. Next, we have manage user identity and roles. Now note that this skill is weighted at 35 to 40% of the exam. So if this is an area you don't know much about, you might need to spend a little bit more time studying. In this topic, you'll be measured on setting up users and roles and then managing them, both within Azure AD as well as using Azure AD Connect. You'll need to understand how to craft synchronization connections, and that's a critical component of the exam. You'll also delve into role management within Azure AD, as well as how to manage identities. Next, we have manage access and authentication. This one is weighted at 20 to 25% of the exam. You'll be measured extensively on utilizing multi-factor authentication within Azure AD, along with specifics around authentication configuration and protections. You'll also need to understand how to configure application registrations within Azure AD, and then some basics of using the Azure AD application proxy component. If you have not worked with external user accounts, specifically using what's called Azure B2B or the B2B, then you'll need to spend some time studying that also. It's not just about sharing externally from within SharePoint, for example. It's functionally how that works within Azure AD. And then finally, the smallest weighted section here, which is 10 to 15%, is plan Office 365 workloads and applications. This skill focuses on topics such as hybrid deployment, using on-premises workloads with Microsoft 365. You'll also be measured on Office application deployment. Now, this is often an area where most people don't study as needed. I would recommend a little bit more effort in studying here, specifically around deployments of the Office 365 Pro Plus applications, either from the web or deployment into Windows 10 devices or even mobile devices. So that's the breakup of the exam. You can see the largest area is really around user identity and roles. And that's really because it encompasses so many different areas, especially when you're synchronizing on-premises accounts to the cloud. Now that we have a sense of the high level for the skills and topics, you'll need to know how to be successful to pass the exam. So we'll look at each skill in more detail, and then we'll run through some sample questions and answers. And we'll start by talking about understanding Microsoft 365 services. Now, the plan here is to go through some specific things that are called up on the exam, and just some areas. Some of them we'll cover in more detail. Some of them will go into the tenant so you can kind of see it firsthand. And then other things we'll just discuss so that you know kind of where to focus on as far as studying. So one of the first areas that comes up is to do with domains within Microsoft 365. And we're talking about DNS domains. Now, in order for us to be able to utilize domains inside Microsoft 365, you'll need to be a global administrator and be associated to a business or an enterprise plan within Office 365. When you add the domains, these changes will affect the whole of the tenant. Customized administrators or regular users will not be able to make use and perform these changes for those domains. You have to be a global administrator. Now, there are two core ways of managing domains. The first one is custom. This means that you're going to go to the domain registrar and manually create a domain entry. So maybe you purchase a domain from something like GoDaddy. GoDaddy is a bit of a bad example because it's also a registrar that uses Domain Connect. But if you went to GoDaddy and bought a domain, you would then need to add that specifically to the Office 365 tenant and manually make sure that all of the specified DNS entries are added. So the TXT entries, the MX records, etc. Now, the better approach is to actually utilize the registrar using Domain Connect. Now, what that means is that there is a list of specific domain registration companies that are supported in Microsoft 365. It's a three-step process that just takes a few minutes. So what this does is you simply go through and say, I wish to purchase the domain, and then you allow the Domain Connect to create the domain, connect it to the tenant, and it will create all of the entries that are needed. Now, Microsoft 365 creates a domain for you, for example, company.onmicrosoft.com, when you sign up with the service. The user ID that you create when you sign up also has that ending. So, you know, if it's administrator, if it's Bob, Sue, it'll be something at company.onmicrosoft.com. Now, the critical things here is that you cannot rename the on Microsoft domain after you've signed up. So if you've called it, you know, liamscompany.onmicrosoft.com, you cannot change that. You cannot rename some of the URLs that get created through the tenant also. You can't remove the on Microsoft domain either. You can also keep the onmicrosoft.com domain after you've added your own domains, and you can still utilize that because email and other services can still utilize that. If you wish to add any subdomains, you must manage your own DNS settings at the registrar website. However, if you're letting Microsoft manage the DNS settings with name server records, or if you bought the domain directly from Microsoft, you are unable to add subdomains. So it's important to understand this is kind of step one of putting a tenant together. You provision the tenant, and then you choose the domains that need to go in there. So one of the first questions to kind of go through is, can you add a custom subdomain or multiple domains to Microsoft 365? Now, you guys don't have to answer. I'm going to give the answer to that one. But it's important to know this one because there are instances where you may wish to utilize either subdomains or multiple domains. And of course, quite rightly so, the answer is yes. You can add subdomains, but you must do that manually at the registrar website. However, as we mentioned earlier, if Microsoft is managing it, then you can't add subdomains at all. Now, typically, you can add up to 900 domains to your Microsoft 365 subscription. I have yet to find someone that has that many. When you add a subdomain, it will automatically be verified based on the parent domain that was verified. So if your domain is, companyaa.com, and you decide to add subdomain.companyaa.com, it will automatically be verified because of the parent. So you can add subdomains. In the real world, I've seen this done. For example, I've done some work with education, with schools, what's called a multi-trust academy type thing, where there's lots of schools under one umbrella, and they will often use subdomains to represent each school, even though all the accounts will come into the same Azure Active Directory. When the accounts are registered to the domains, you can pick the subdomain, and that becomes the email address for them. Now, of course, you will still need the MX records and things too. So just be aware, this will be something that is important in the domain and the Microsoft 365 deployment and will be questioned. Okay, now most organizations have existing networking, identity, and other components or Microsoft on-premises products and cloud-based services. Maybe you are one of those where you come from an organization that utilizes multiple things. Microsoft 365 supports hybrid configuration, allowing use of cloud services directly within applications, for example, such as Exchange and SharePoint. Now, there are 5 core phases to deploying Microsoft 365 when you're utilizing it with an on-premises or an existing infrastructure. The first thing to check is that the offices have adequate internet bandwidth. Now, when you're working through the exam questions, it's important to read the scenarios that are presented to you. There will be scenarios that will discuss this is this office, that's that office, and the connection between the two. So potentially looking for issues that could arise will be down to the adequate internet bandwidth. You also need to make sure that global administrator accounts are protected to make sure that they can't be utilized from one to the other. And there's specific services available for that in 365. Then, of course, users and groups need to be synchronized with Azure AD. Now, we'll stop for a second here because you can utilize the tenant without synchronizing accounts if you wanted to. However, if you want to do single sign-on between on-premises all the way through to Microsoft 365, then the recommended topology and approach is to use Azure AD Connect and synchronize those accounts. Now, of course, we'll talk about that a little bit more later, where we talk about the different topologies that you can utilize for that. You also need to make sure the Microsoft 365 domain has been added and verified. And then if you're utilizing it, then configure Windows Autopilot if you want to add devices. Now, just so you know, that last option as number 5, you won't get questioned so much on Windows Autopilot. That one's not really for this MS-100 exam, but if you are taking MS-101, then that comes in as part of that one. Now, once you've connected everything together and you have your Azure AD Connect in place, the next thing is to choose the authentication methods that are available. Now, as part of the sign experience for accounts directly with Azure AD, there are different ways that users can authenticate themselves. The most common is username and password. With modern authentication and security features in Azure AD, the basic password option can then be replaced with additional methods. So a user in Azure AD can choose to authenticate either traditional username and password. You can't disable this either. You can't suddenly switch off the idea of passing a username and password. We then have what's called the app, so utilizing the Microsoft Authenticator app for a passwordless sign-in. This provides an additional level of security. And that's more of a recent one. And then, of course, we have what's referred to as SMS. So this Okay, so the question for this one will be, which authentication method provides a true passwordless experience for end users? Now, if we think the 4 options through, we've got traditional username and password. We have Microsoft Authenticator app, passwordless sign-in. We then have the OAuth hardware token or the FIDO keys, and then we have the SMS-based sign-in. So 4 different options to choose from. Now, the correct answer for this one is the SMS sign-in. So with the SMS-based sign-in, Users don't need to know a username and a password to access applications and services. The user instead enters the registered mobile phone number, receives the text message with a verification code, and then enters that in the sign-in interface. Users can also verify themselves using a mobile phone or office phone as the secondary form of authentication used during, for example, multi-factor authentication or the self-service password reset. So the same function can be used across different services and different capabilities. So we'll talk about multi-factor a little bit later, but when you actually have end users register and receive that kind of token that they can utilize, then they can take use of this. Now, Microsoft provides a hierarchy of organizations, subscriptions, licenses, and user accounts for consistent use of identities, as well as billing across all the cloud offerings. Now, the core cloud offerings are not just limited to SharePoint and Exchange. This will include Microsoft 365, Microsoft Office 365, Microsoft Azure, and then Microsoft Dynamics 365. The core hierarchy consists of an organization, which represents the business entity that is using the Microsoft Cloud offerings. So, for example, the organization, so the organization that you work for, etc. This is mapped to the DNS name, such as domain.com, and then the organization is a container for the subscriptions that you have and that you purchase. Now, the subscription is an agreement with Microsoft to use one or more cloud platforms or services for which you then get charged either per user or consumption. So Microsoft Software as a Service, so we're talking about the SaaS model here, so Microsoft 365 charge per user, whereas the PaaS or Platform as a Service and Infrastructure as a Service, which is Azure, obviously are based on consumption. You can have multiple subscriptions for the Microsoft Cloud offerings. So even though you are one organization, you can have multiple subscriptions to different services. What that means is that then you can have multiple licenses associated to the subscriptions. A license allows a specific user account to use the service of the cloud offering. Now, I will caveat this here. There are some sections within Microsoft 365 where there's no license validation. You just need to have a license, and then after that, there's nothing that restricts or blocks them out. There are some sections, however, that even if the user doesn't have a license, they can still actually go through. Now, administrators assign the licenses to individual user accounts within that subscription. Now, for the user accounts, all Microsoft Cloud offerings store those accounts directly in Azure AD. Even though you may manage it inside the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, there's always a Azure Active Directory tenant available to you. It's the cut down version. You don't get all of the virtual machines and all that kind of stuff. You literally just get a free subscription to Azure Active Directory, which is the container for all the accounts. And then, of course, you have the tenant. The tenant is the regional location that houses the servers providing cloud services. So, for example, if you are a company in the European region, you can then choose to host those in the European region using the geolocated pieces. If you are here in the US, then of course you can do that too. So it's important to note that if you're looking at some of the different types of scenarios, that there will be organizations in different countries, and you'll have to determine where the tenants should reside. So the hierarchy is really organization, company, domain name. I mean, that's really what it comes down to, is the DNS name, and then whatever subscriptions and licenses and accounts that you actually have generated. Now, you can combine multiple cloud offerings together and the subscriptions can be joined. So, for example, if I have Microsoft 365 and Azure and Dynamics 365, you can see my table is kind of the same values. So on the left-hand side, this is what I have. And then on the top right-hand side going across will be what I can add. So, for example, if I've got Microsoft 365 as a subscription, I can add a full-blown Azure subscription to that organization. I can also add a Dynamics 365 subscription to that too. Now, if I were starting with an Azure tenant, then I can add a Microsoft 365 subscription to that organization as well. I obviously can't add another Azure to an Azure, but I can add a Dynamics 365. And then for our Dynamics 365, I can do the same thing. I can add a 365 subscription, add an Azure one as well. So it's most important to understand that irrelevant of where you start from, if you're an organization that has an Azure subscription only, you can join that organization and create Microsoft 365 or Dynamics 365 subscriptions and then join them together. Now, this will be important to understand that, especially when you're looking at the use case scenarios of how to get licensing. It will be adding subscriptions together. Now, when it comes to managing the users and groups, so we have our organization, we have our tenant, we have our subscriptions, we have our licenses. Really, the day-to-day administration components are really mapped around being able to manage users and groups. You can either use Azure Active Directory, the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, or PowerShell to add users and groups and assign licenses. Azure AD allows for manual creation of users and groups. And I'm talking about the Azure AD portal at this point. It's defined as an AAD user. So when you create a user, you are creating an AAD user. And we'll talk about that in a minute with PowerShell. The licenses can then be assigned as part of that. And the users can then be assigned to groups and roles. If we use the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, then you can add them directly from that single pane. These are defined as what's called MSOL or MSOL users, so Microsoft Online users. Now, just so you know, they are one in the same. An AAD user is the same as an MSOL user. They're just tagged differently. Licenses can be assigned and users can be assigned to groups and to roles, the same as you can in Azure AD. If we utilize PowerShell, then there's support for both the Azure AD and the Microsoft Online PowerShell modules. They are two separate PowerShell modules. You can use, for example, a new MSOL user, or you can say new Azure AD user. They will both end up creating an account in Azure Active Directory, but the properties may be different because the PowerShell modules are different. The licenses can also be assigned utilizing PowerShell and also add them to groups and roles. The most granular management outside of utilizing PowerShell should be done within the Azure AD management user interface, where you will have better access to some of the more controlled properties that are not available inside the regular Microsoft 365 admin. So I'm just going to come out of this and go here to my tenant. So I've logged into the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and I'm just going to expand here because I'm going to click Active Directory as well. We'll leave that loading. But from my users, I can click Active Users in Microsoft Admin Center here. And when I click Add User, you can see the kind of wizard process that I get to go through. So I'm going to call this one Test User 1. Test User 1. You can see I've got my domain. I'm going to auto-generate a password. I'm going to uncheck the box, choose Next. And then you can see I get to do license assignment as part of this wizard. So I can go through and say, I want to associate, let's do Office 365. I'll tell you what, let's do the Windows 10 one here. Choose Next. And then you can see I've got access to the roles. So I can modify these from here. And if I expand the profile info, you can see it exposes some of the properties that are available. So job title, department, office. These are ones that have been specifically crafted for this admin center. So I could go through and just say next, and then it will generate me my account. Now, if I go back to the Azure Active Directory dashboard, click on here, and then go to users, you get a similar look. If I click new user, you'll see that it kind of looks the same, except it gives me two different options. We'll talk about the invited users later, but you can see I get to add the name, the first name, the last name, the groups can be added here, and then I have some basic values. So you can see that the creation process is a little bit different depending which approach that you take. Now, however, if we go back to users and I click into my Adele account, for example, and I say edit, you can see that I get access to a lot more information here inside Azure Active Directory than I would do utilizing the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. So just be aware that the place to be able to manage accounts correctly outside of your on-premises Active Directory, if you're utilizing Azure AD Connect, should really be around Azure Active Directory and managing the users at that point. Now, when it comes to monitoring Microsoft 365, after you have all the users in and they start using the services, you need to understand where to go to monitor. Now, you can view the health of your Microsoft services, including Office on the Web, Yammer, Microsoft Dynamics CRM, and the Mobile Device Management Cloud services in the Service Health page in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. It's broken down into specific things. So you can see we have incidents. This is where there's a critical service issue, typically involving user impact. So let's say Microsoft Exchange Online suddenly drops off the face of the earth. This will then get flagged as an incident. We then also have access to advisories. An advisory is a service issue that's typically limited in scope or impact. So for example, SharePoint Online or OneDrive for Business tends to have very regular service advisories, just something unique that's happened and it's being looked at. You also then have access to the history, anything in the past. So if you wanted to know, well, hey, something happened a month ago and it impacted one of our users, you could go back through the history and see if there was a specific advisory. We then also have reported issues. So you can track the status of issues that are reported by people in your specific organization over the last 30 days. So that brings us to a knowledge check. So where would you go to check for any service interruptions or issues within Microsoft 365? Now, of course, we have directory sync status, threat protection reports, service health, message center. So 4 different options to pick from. The answer for this one is service health, because you can view all of the information about specific service issues directly there. If I go to my Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and I'm going to close here. If I go down to the health option that appears on the left and click service health, you can see from here that if I click on all services option, this lists me everything. But if I change that to incidents, you'll see there's currently no critical service instances at the moment. If I click advisories, then advisories give us more detail. So you can see we have 3 Exchange Online, and then we have Microsoft 365 service degradation. So each of these, you can click onto them and it will give you a breakdown of the specific advisory. So then you can then reach out to your end users who may be experiencing that issue, and they will be able to say, okay, this is the current issue, this is the scope, and when the next update is going to be available. So from an administrator perspective, you can instantly see if and when Microsoft on specific issues. If I then click into history and go here, you can see that I can view any of the history Since we have everything in the tenant, we have users, we have licenses, our next thing is to plan user and data migration. Now, there are specific data migration options that are available. The first one is Migration Manager. This is available in the SharePoint Admin Center, and the Migration Manager provides a central way of connecting servers, creating tasks, and then kind of distributing that migration task. The next one is the SharePoint Migration Tool. So this one's referred to as a first-party migration tool. The SharePoint Migration Tool can migrate files from SharePoint on-premises document libraries, lists, or even regular file shares directly up to SharePoint Online or OneDrive. The most recent one added here is Mover. This is the service that Microsoft acquired for cloud migration, and you can do some on-premises migration too. You could utilize PowerShell. There's a PowerShell version of the SharePoint migration tool. So instead of using the user interface, you use PowerShell scripts and it will do the same thing. You also have Microsoft Fast Track. So the Fast Track services can help you get started with the migration from the cloud. It's using Microsoft services and designated partners to perform that migration. We also have some other ones here. So Azure Data Box. So the Azure Data Box is a service that lets you order a specific device from Microsoft. You then copy all of the data onto that device, ship it back to Microsoft, and then they will copy the data into Azure, into basically Azure storage. And then you can utilize the SharePoint migration tool to migrate the content out of that Azure storage directly into SharePoint or OneDrive. You could also do some manual options here where you've got the OneDrive sync. So after you've installed the OneDrive sync app, you can drag and drop files from the local computer, and then they will sync up to the locations. You've then also got manual upload, which nobody enjoys doing. So uploading files one at a time or groups of files. And then, of course, you can also run the SharePoint assessment tool, which is part of the SharePoint migration tool, which is that first-party one written by Microsoft. It allows you to assess and identify issues with the SharePoint server content prior to it migrating. So if you're utilizing that tool, you'll run the assessment first. You can also run a secondary tool that will be able to match accounts from on-prem to the cloud, and then you'll use the SharePoint migration tool to do that. Now, if you're migrating mail, there's a series of options that are currently available. You can migrate all mailboxes at once. That's what's called the cutover migration. So you basically just move them straight over. You've got migrate mailboxes in batches. That's the staged migration. You can migrate using an integrated Exchange server and Microsoft 365 or Office 365 hybrid. So that means you have an on-premises Exchange environment, hybrid connected to the cloud, and then you can start to move things around. You could also import exported PST files. So if you only have a few users in the organization you want to migrate, PSTs might be a simple approach. And then, of course, you can migrate from an IMAP-enabled system as well, which is a really simple, clean way of moving things. So data migration is really around utilizing tools. So when you're looking at the scenario questions of moving content from file shares upwards, you'll be utilizing. So depending on the size of the business and the organization that you work for or that you look after and the technical requirements, the hybrid identity model and directory synchronization is the most common choice for organizations adopting Microsoft 365. Directory synchronization allows you to manage identities locally in on-prem Azure Active Directory and then make all the updates to the user accounts, groups, and contacts on-prem locally, and then synchronize them to Microsoft 365. There are two types of authentication when using the hybrid identity model. The first one is managed authentication. So Azure AD handles the authentication process by using a locally stored hashed version of the password, or sends the credentials to an on-premises software agent to then be authenticated locally. There are two types of managed authentication. One is called password hash synchronization, or PHS, and then one is called pass-through authentication, PTA. The second option here is federated authentication. So Azure AD redirects the client computer requesting the authentication to whatever the other authentication identity provider is. So for example, if it's local Active Directory federated services, or if it's a third-party provider, when the end user hits Office 365, they'll type in their email address and it will instantly redirect them to where they're supposed to authenticate. Federation authentication is primarily used for larger organizations that have kind of more complex authentication requirements. However, more recently, lots of different organizations are moving to this kind of approach because the federated idea allows you to do single sign-on to other applications that may not live in the Microsoft cloud. AD/DS identities are synchronized through Azure AD Connect. And so there's an account on premises, an account that's synchronized, which effectively you could think of as like a shadow account, but all authentication is done through the ADFS implementation or the federated platform. The users will then have the same password on premises and the cloud, but they don't need to log in directly to the cloud because the federated platform will take care of that. Now, when you're looking at the scenarios in the exam, obviously there will be instances where regular password hash synchronization is the most common, and then there will be times where federated authentication is the option to choose. If you need to do single sign-on to other applications, for example, federating to, for example, an Azure application or a web application that's been custom built, then a federated authentication model is the option to choose. Now, Microsoft doesn't support modifying or operating Azure AD Sync outside of the configurations or topology designs that Microsoft have formally documented. So any of these configurations or actions, if it's changed, could result in an inconsistent or unsupported state of Azure AD Connect Sync. As a result, this is an important thing to note, Microsoft won't provide technical support if your Azure AD Connect Sync topology does not match the approved Microsoft topologies. The first one to talk about here is the single forest. This is the most common topology. It's a single on-premises forest with one or multiple domains and a single Azure AD tenant. In all fairness, for most people that I ever speak to, that's the design that they have. For Azure AD authentication, password hash synchronization is used, and it's just utilizing the express installation of Azure AD Connect. It's really simple, straightforward, the easiest one to do. And this is the most common implementation. Then we have what's referred to as multiple forests. So many organizations have environments with multiple on-premises Active Directory forests. There are various reasons for having more than one on-premise. For example, it could be to do with resource forests. It could be because of a merger and acquisition. Now, when you have multiple forests, all forests must be reachable by a single Azure AD Connect Sync server, and that server must be joined to the domain. Now, there are 4 sub-topologies built into the multiple forest approach. There is the multiple forest, multiple sync servers to one Azure AD tenant. There's multiple forest, single sync server, and users are represented in one directory. You've then got multiple forests, which is what's called full mesh with an optional global address list synchronization approach. And then, of course, you've got multiple forests and what's referred to as an account resource forest. An account resource forest is literally that. It's just a forest that has resource accounts for specific services or applications that you're connecting to. Most of the scenarios will talk through single forest. There will be some instances where multiple forest, and mainly focused on option number 1 there, which is multiple forest, multiple sync servers to one Azure AD tenant. So the idea being that we basically sync in everything from an organization to a single tenant. Multiple tenants, multiple synchronization is very, very complicated. Another option here is to utilize Azure Active Directory services. So this allows you to configure federation with on-premises ADFS and Azure AD. Now, the Azure AD Connect tooling will let you do this. Now, the process to this is to create your Active Directory Federated Services farm. It does need to either be brand new or you need to create that new farm. Then you specify any web application proxy servers. This is also a critical key here, is that we have ADFS servers and then you have web application proxy servers. We used to have ADFS proxy servers, but they don't exist anymore. They are now web application proxy servers that serve as the ADFS proxies. You'll then configure the service account for the on-premises that will allow that connection. Then you'll set the Azure AD domain to federate, and then you'll configure that process. This will then ensure that when a user hits your Office 365 tenant, that they will then pass in it, user@domain.com, and it will redirect them to that on-premises Active Directory federated, via the web application proxy server, and then they will then be able to federate and authenticate. So Azure AD Connect will support that design. Now, when utilizing Azure AD Connect, you can enable filtering of accounts at any time. If you start with the default configuration of directory synchronization, and then you decide to change to filtering, the objects that are filtered may no longer be synchronized to Azure AD. So just be aware it could change. Because of this change, any objects in Azure AD that were previously synchronized but were then filtered are deleted in Azure AD. Now, of course, as you may be aware, when you delete items in Azure AD, they end up staying around for a while inside the deleted users container. Now, before you start making changes to filtering, make sure that you disable the scheduled task so that you don't accidentally export changes that you haven't verified. There are different types of filtering objects that are available. The first type is group-based. This is filtering based on a single group and can be configured in the initial installation as part of the wizard. This is quite common to be able to go in and say, I want to test my Azure AD Connect, and in order for that to work, I'm going to choose this specific security group from my on-premises AD and synchronize that. That's quite common. The next one, which is even more common, is to select the domains that you wish to synchronize. Many organizations I've worked with basically use Azure AD Connect to sync everything in the domain. Now, that's actually not best practice. You shouldn't be synchronizing everything. You should choose the types of things that you wish to sync. So you can add and remove domains from the sync engine configuration at any point, and any changes made on premises, you can then synchronize those back through. The next option that's quite common is organizational filtering. So this is selecting OUs to synchronize to Azure AD. These three options will come up as filtering capabilities to then determine whether you want to filter by organization or domain or group. So utilizing an OU can then have a deep OU structure or a specific OU structure, and then you can determine the types of objects you wish to filter. Our last one here is attribute-based. So you can filter objects based on attribute values on the objects. So for example, if we pick a user or a computer or something else, there are various properties within Azure AD, and you can filter on those specific attributes. Now, bear in mind that the on-premises attributes don't match 100% to the Azure AD properties either. Most of them do, yet there are some differences. You also have to have different filters for different object types. So for example, if I want to synchronize computers because I want to do hybrid Azure AD joined, then I need to utilize different filter types to say computers instead of users, instead of groups, etc. Okay, so which Azure AD filtering type should be used to filter using the manager property? So of course, if you remember our four options here, we have group, domain, organizational, and attribute. Now, of course, our answer here is D, attribute. Attribute-based filtering is the most flexible way to filter objects. You can use the power of declarative provisioning to control every aspect of when an object is synchronized to Azure AD. You can apply inbound filtering from Active Directory to the metaverse. The metaverse is the middle layer here, and outbound filtering from the metaverse to Azure AD. Microsoft recommends that you apply inbound filtering because it's the easiest to maintain. You should only use the outbound filtering if it's required to join objects from more than one forest before the evaluation can take place. So just be aware that when you're looking at filtering and limiting what comes in via Azure AD, maybe the scenario is a pilot, that you may end up starting with one type of filtering and then changing as you move down the line. And then, of course, remember the importance here of inbound and outbound filtering. Inbound is from the local AD to the metaverse. The metaverse is that central structure that's contained within Azure AD Connect. And then the metaverse to Azure AD is the outbound piece, which is whatever we've structured in the metaverse now gets pushed out the other way. So now that Azure AD Connect is kind of connected, we have it synchronizing. Now there are some capabilities that we need to look at, which will help in end user authentication. So what we have is Azure Active Directory Self-Service Password Reset, or it's called SSPR. Users can update their passwords or unlock their account using a web browser. In a hybrid environment where Azure AD is connected to an on-premises AD, this scenario can cause passwords to be different between the two directories. This is quite a common one that we've seen, where you say you can do a password reset, and they do a password reset, and then the passwords are completely different, and then they end up getting locked out. The password write back can be used to synchronize the password changes in Azure AD back to the on-premises Active Directory environment. Now, of course, the steps to configure here the PWD last set property and give that account write access. And that will be delegated permission that you will assign. You'll then need to enable password write back in Azure AD Connect. Literally, there's a checkbox for that. You configure the synchronization and just check the option called password write back. You'll then need to enable password write back in self-service password reset, so the SSPR, so that when users change or reset their passwords, it will synchronize back the other way. So this is an important piece about password write back. You will be questioned on password write back and the SSPR. It's really straightforward. Everything in Azure AD is a series of check options that are available inside the tenant. Now, we also have the ability to define password policies within Azure AD. So if you remember, when you come from the on-premises world, there's group policies we can create, there's specific security policies that we can create. However, once we get into Azure AD, it doesn't seem to be as flexible. However, in Azure Active Directory, there are specific properties available to us that we can set within there for passwords. You can define characters that are allowed, characters that are not allowed. There are password restrictions that we can define, as well as a password expiration duration. So that's the maximum password age. We can then do password expiry notifications. So if users are notified of password expiration, then of course we have password expiry. So choosing whether to allow passwords to never expire. You can view the password change history. You can obviously view the reset history, and then you can view if the account is actually locked out. So let's go into my Azure Active Directory here. Now in the Azure Active Directory, when you actually scroll up and down, it's quite hard often to see where this comes from. So if I click Azure AD Connect, for example, it'll just give me basic details, but there's nothing in here around that. If I click password reset, you can see that I have my SSPR configuration available. So what I can do is it says self-service password is enabled for this specific security group. If I choose all, then it means everybody has that available, or I can click into the group and then choose the groups that I wish to allow self-service password reset for. Now, this may be an option that you want to roll out to smaller groups as a pilot. And so you'll come into here and choose, for example, I'm going to say Contoso Finance, and I'll click select. And now it's available to that specific group. If I go back into here and click, you can see I can only add one specific group at a time. So just be aware you can't bulk add it to everybody using this method. If I click on authentication methods, I'm going to click OK here. You'll see here that it gives me the number of methods that are required to reset. So what needs to be provided in order for the password reset to function. So you can see I need to provide the email and the mobile phone, an SMS text value that comes in. I could say I need security questions, and I need 3 questions to be done, and I need 3 questions to reset. And then you can go through and click, and you can define predefined questions if you wanted to. I'm going to uncheck that. So from here, you can say we can do password reset. These are the properties available to it, as in the security groups that are allowed to use it. And then these are the authentication mechanisms. If I go into registration, it says here, require users to register when signing in. This forces the end users to provide and complete the information so that they can complete a password reset. So there's kind of a 3-step phase here. Make sure the properties are enabled for either everybody or the group you wish to use. Define the authentication methods that are needed to validate the password reset, and then go through the registration process. I'm going to click back into my directory here. If I click into security now, into this option, you'll see that I get other things available to us, which we'll talk, but I want to click on authentication methods here. And if I click password protection, you can see I then have other capabilities which are part of those properties that we can set. So for example, my lockout threshold, my duration in seconds, are we going to block specific words for passwords? And then do I want to allow password protection down on premises for the Windows server? And then what the mode is. So I'm in audit mode. So this is default configuration here. So if you look at the number 10 for the lockout threshold, if you hover, it says how many failed logins. So that means I can log in failure 10 times, and then it will start locking out for durations of 60 seconds and longer. So all that configuration is done directly inside Azure Active Directory. There are no capabilities for that within the Microsoft 365 piece. Okay, so for our question, which password policy property should be modified to disable or enable expiration of passwords? Is it password restrictions, password expiry duration, password expiry, or password expiry notification? They all look the same after a while. Our answer here is password expiry. The default value is set to false, which indicates that the passwords have an expiration date. So just be aware that it kind of seems a bit strange, but false means that they have an expiration date. You have to physically come in and say, I don't want to expire passwords. And actually, best practice is now dictating that you don't expire passwords, that you provide other mechanisms and you leave the passwords for as long as you could leave them. Because in reality, the password should still be as good as it was today in 60 days from now. It shouldn't have changed. Now, of course, the only exception to the rule here is in the event of a compromised account, then of course you will want to change expiration. Okay, so licenses can be assigned on a per user basis. That's the standard common approach that most organizations go through. They assign a password at a specific user. However, the recommended approach is to use group-based assignment. So the licenses then get assigned to the security groups in Azure AD. So remember, we're back to Azure AD again. We're not in Microsoft 365 admin. When the product license is assigned to a group, you as the administrator can disable one or more of the service plans in the product. All Microsoft Cloud services that require any type of user level licensing are supported. Group-based licensing is currently only available in the Azure portal. Azure AD automatically will manage license modifications that results from group memberships that have changed. A user can be a member of multiple groups with license policies that have been specified. So I'm going to go back into the tenant to walk through this. So here I am in the tenant. I'm going to click on groups this time, and you'll see I get my list of groups here. So I'm going to go into my Contoso IT, click into that group, and what you'll see is you've got properties, members, applications, etc. And if I look at the abilities here, if I click on properties, I can go to members, I can go to group memberships. You'll notice that there's no license capabilities here. So let me go back and go to groups. And what we'll do is we'll look at the different types of groups that are available. So you can see that these are Office. So these are Office 365 groups that were created. Then you've got distribution groups, which obviously come from Exchange. And then we have security groups, which are standard permission boundary groups. If I click into SG Engineering, you'll see that my licenses option now appears. So just be aware that licensing option is not available for every type of group that's been created. If it's an Office 365 group, it doesn't work. If it's a distribution group, it won't work either. So we can go to licenses for a security group. And when I go into licenses, it will say there's no license assignment. I can click assignments. And then you'll see the types of licenses I have. So if I click Windows 10, I can then select that license here and choose save. And then that license object is associated to that specific group. Now, what that means is that when I actually add users to this group, they will all receive that specific license. So if I click into members, you can see that I've got Joanna, Lee, Raoul, etc. So if I click Delia, for example, and click licenses, at the moment it says no licenses, and that's exactly as it should be, because the process hasn't ran to be able to say assign the licenses. This is one thing to be aware of, not really necessarily for the exam, but you can see it here. It says license changes are pending. There is a process of time that needs to run. Now, how long this is, it's magic. It can be a few minutes. It can be a long time. It depends on the number of members, but this will complete. And if at any point it doesn't work, you can click reprocess and the licenses will then be reassociated to the users. Now, what's nice here is if the user moves out of the group, then they are removed from that license also. So any questions that come up about license assignment and whether groups should be used, groups is the recommended approach. Now, with organizational growth, as you kind of grow through the tenant, one common issue or response that comes to the amount of work is kind of delegating some of those permissions and those admin functions within Azure AD. You can assign the least privilege, the least possible privilege to users to access their apps and perform the tasks. Even if you don't assign the global administrator role to every application owner, you're placing application management responsibilities on the existing global administrators. There are lots of reasons why you might want to move towards a decentralized administration. Now, in order for this to happen, there are some steps to perform for delegation. The first one is define the roles that you need. You then delegate the app administration. You then grant the ability to register applications, then delegate app ownership, develop a security plan that maps around that. Then you establish what's called emergency accounts. You then secure the administrator roles and then make privileged elevation temporarily available. Now, one of the options I want to talk about here is emergency accounts. They're often referred to as break glass accounts. This is a best practice because an emergency account or break glass account is there to provide access if all other authentication mechanisms fail or have a problem. So think of the scenario here. I'm working in the tenant as a global admin. Everything is protected by multi-factor. Microsoft have an issue with multi-factor. All of a sudden, I can no longer log in, even as a global administrator. So establishing emergency or break glass accounts is actually a recommendation for managing a Microsoft 365 tenant. So what is the purpose of a break glass account? Is it A, backdoor access to the tenant? I actually quite like that answer. Does it B, provide access if all other access is denied or blocked? C, is it for non-assigned administrator access? Or D, is it one of those magical shared accounts that everybody wants to use for managing the tenant? Well, of course, our correct answer here is to provide access if all other access is denied or blocked. It's important that you prevent being accidentally locked out of the Azure AD tenant, because if you can't sign in or you can't activate another account, you can't administer the tenant. You can mitigate the impact of accidental locking out by creating those emergency access accounts. Emergency access accounts are normally highly privileged and they are not assigned to a specific individual. So it wouldn't be your account, that would be the emergency account. Emergency accounts are limited to emergency or break glass, as I called it, scenarios where normal administrative accounts can't be used. Microsoft recommends that you maintain a goal of restricting emergency account use to only the times when it's actually necessary. For example, you might use an emergency access account for some common scenarios. For example, the user accounts are federated via ADFS, for example, and federation is currently unavailable because of a network outage or a provider outage. So for example, if the identity provider host in the environment went down, users might not be able to sign in when Azure AD redirects to that identity provider. So it could be the administrators are registered for Azure multi-factor and that suddenly becomes unavailable. Or it could be that there's a cell phone network outage that's preventing people from passing the multi-factor. It could be the person with the most recent global admin access left the organization. Azure AD prevents the last global admin account from being deleted. So if you've got rid of everybody and there's one person left, but it doesn't prevent the account from being deleted or disabled on premises, that would cause it to not be available either. And then, of course, unforeseen circumstances such as natural disaster, where mobile phones or other networks become unavailable. So it's important to provide break glass accounts to help give you access in the event of an emergency. Okay, so before we move on to this one, I'm just going to answer a question. The question is, what happens to users' data if they are moved out of the group and the license is removed inadvertently? That's a fantastic question. So the data still stands. Whether they can access the service that contains the data, that's a separate issue, but they will still be able to, that data will still reside. It won't get removed. Ideally, what you would do is utilize either notification mechanisms or the logging capabilities to be able to be notified when someone does that. So there's no real fix around this one. If I have, Exchange and SharePoint and OneDrive license associated to me via a group and I get removed out, everything still stays. I just have that license unassigned to me. And so the next time I try to access it based on the license checks in those few instances, everything will still stay as it is. Okay, so our next skill that's measured is actually understanding access and authentication. The first piece here is enabling multi-factor authentication. There are three core approaches to enabling multi-factor authentication. The first one is what used to be the recommended one, which is user assigned. So this is you going in, selecting the end users, and directly assigning multi-factor to those specific users, whether it's done directly in Azure AD or whether it's done utilizing the Microsoft 365 Admin Center. Either way, it's directly assigned to a user. The second option is condition-based. So this uses conditional access policies where you can control multi-factor authentication requests and also obviously forcing people to kind of register. So your first option is physically assigned to a user. Second is maybe not assigned to a user, but because of various conditions, it then forces that. And then our third option is utilizing Azure AD to force all users to register for multi-factor preferences and registration. All of these will work. All of these will work as expected. The question here is, which approach should be used to ensure that all users can utilize multi-factor authentication? Now, of course, in reality, you could say A, B, and C. I mean, that would literally be all of the answers. But actually, our answer here is conditional access. Conditional access policies are now the preferred approach for enabling and enforcing multi-factor on all user accounts. Though the forced registration can be used, it's part of the user sign-in and risky sign-in process, it will only force the registration of that, not necessarily force multi-factor unless you have that licensed. So from an out-of-the-box capabilities with most licensing, either directly user assigned or conditional access would work. The other ones require Azure AD Premium licensing. Now, when we are looking at managing users and authenticating people in, one of the big areas that comes up is external users and being able to utilize them inside the tenant. So when we talk about external users, we need to understand how they get licensed within the tenant. So firstly, business to business, or B2B as it's referred to in Azure AD, guest user licensing is automatically calculated and reported based on the 1:5 ratio. Now, I am going to tell you, this will come up if you decide to take MS-100, and actually if you decide to go a little bit further and take MS-500, this one is specifically called out and you have to calculate the right amount of licenses. Guest users can use free Azure AD features with no additional licensing requirements. And guest users have access to free Azure AD features even if you don't have any paid Azure AD licenses. So once they're added as an external guest on the 1:5 ratio, then they have access to those free features. They cannot use the premium features in Azure AD without having an actual license. And that goes the same for employees as well. So let's look at some examples, and these are example scenarios that are kind of common, and you will get some of these on the exam. So let's say you want to invite 100 guest users to your Azure AD app or service and provide access management and provisioning. So that's the requirement here. I have 100 guest users that I wish to add. So what you'll need is, as far as our second one goes, for 50 of those guests, we also want to require multi-factor authentication and conditional access. Now, to do that, you'll need 10 Azure AD Premium 1 licenses. So remember our 1:5 ratio. So if I want 100 guests, 50 of which were to use multi-factor and conditional access, I have to make sure I have 10 Azure AD Premium P1 licenses, because that gives me my 50. For the other 50, I wish to use protection features for the guest users, and I'll need Azure AD Premium 2 licenses in that same 1:5 ratio. So if I had 50 users that I wish to use identity protection in, I would need 10 Azure AD Premium P2 licenses in the tenant to cover the 1:5 ratio. Most important thing to take away from here is the 1:5 ratio. A second example, let's say you want to invite 60 guests who will all require multi-factor. In that scenario, you're going to need to have at least 12 Azure AD Premium P1 licenses. You have 10 employees with Azure AD Premium P1 licenses, which allows up to 50. So there's a shortfall of licensing. So you would need to purchase 2 additional Premium P1 licenses to cover those 10 additional guest users. Now, the way this often lays out in the exam is there'll be a table, and it will say this many people, this is the licenses we've got, what do we need? And that's how you'll kind of flow through. But they'll be written very much like this. So just be aware, it's a 1:5 ratio. And depending on the features that you wish to add, you need that 1:5 based on that license. Now, of course, in the real world, from a cost perspective, having a bunch of P1 licenses and a bunch of P2 licenses, maybe EMS licenses, maybe E5 licenses, it's still the same ratio of 1:5. You'll just need to double check. It's not always Azure AD Premium licenses that you need, because if you have, Microsoft 365 E5 license, of the methods. PowerShell can be used to create a user type of guest. Guest users can also belong to security groups. And then guest users can also be added to specific applications and services. The status of the redemption is available in Azure AD. Now, to do this utilizing PowerShell, you'll need to utilize the Azure AD preview module instead of the Azure AD one or the MS Online one. You'll then connect to the tenant domain, or you can, if you have one, you can just say connect Azure AD. And then we're going to issue what's called the new ADMS, Azure ADMS invitation. From here, you can issue the user display name, the email address of the end user, the redirect URL that you wish to go to. So if you were doing this for SharePoint Online, it would be your SharePoint Online URL, or it could be, if it's an Azure application, it would be the Azure application. And then if you want to send an invitation message as part of that. Now, there is a default message that gets sent. You can add to that by generating, if you're using PowerShell, you can generate HTML structure for that and then send that as part of that PowerShell. You also have the ability to do this using the Microsoft Graph, and you can also just use the out-of-the-box capability. Now I'm going to come out of this and we'll go into my Azure Active Directory here. We'll also go back to my list of users in the 365 tenant. Now what you can see when I use the Microsoft 365 Admin Center is when I click Add User, I don't get the ability to determine the type of account to add. If I go to here and choose Users, you'll see the new guest user shows up, and then that shows up as the invite user. Now, if you remember correctly, when I went to Users and did New User, I got that same option either way. So whichever option you click, Create User or Add New Guest User, you can then determine if I wish to invite it as a guest or create it as a regular user. When I do invite, it's literally going to ask me for a name, and then it will ask me for an email address, and then first name, last name. I can type a message, and then you'll see what we can do. We have some basic settings for the user, which is going to be invited. I can say I want to set the usage location to a different country, or block the sign in, or choose the groups it's supposed to be, and then I'll actually click invite at this point. What happens then is it'll then go through and do the invitation. Mine's going to fail, obviously, because that's not a real email address. But what will happen is I'll then be able to see this kind of external guest, which is here. You can see Liam added with that user. If I click on Liam, when I go into it, you can see that I'm an invited user based on the source, and the invitation wasn't accepted. And I can resend the invitation as needed. Now, for most of what you'll do as end users in the tenant, you'll actually end up doing the invitation process via the application. But actually, this is the approach to use as well. You can actually manage adding those external users. That comes down to the external sharing configuration that you wish to utilize. So the question here is, where can you check to see if the external user has accepted and redeemed the invitation? So is it the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, the Azure AD Admin Portal, the Security Admin Center, or the Compliance Admin Center? We were just there. So the answer is the Azure AD Admin Portal. To determine if an external user account has accepted the invitation, the Azure AD Admin Portal should be used. The property name source will be set to invited user if it has not been accepted. Once it is accepted, it will change to one of 4 different values. The first one is external Azure Active Directory. This means the user is homed in an external organization and authenticates by using an Azure AD account that belongs in that other organization. Second is a Microsoft account. This user is homed in a Microsoft account and authenticates by using a Microsoft account. So we're talking a live ID at this point. Then we have Windows Server Active Directory. The user is signed in from an on-premises Active Directory that belongs to the organization. And then, of course, you have Azure Active Directory, where it says this user authenticates by using an Azure AD account that belongs to the organization. So 4 different types of values that can be set. Now, the end user experience is very, very different. So as a side note here, let's run through in our head of what this looks like. So when I actually access the Office 365 tenant, and I am an external Azure Active Directory user from a different organization, when I put my credential in, it will redirect me to my organizational Azure Active Directory. I will then authenticate and then get redirected back to the original location I was going for. What are the downsides to that? Well, often if there's any kind of issues between the two and password issues, often people get confused of which password's being changed, etc. Also, if we're enforcing multi-factor and the other organization is enforcing multi-factor, then they could end up with double multi-factor requests at that point, one from their organization and then one from your organization. The Microsoft account one is a bit more complicated. So this ends up with me hitting the Office 365 site, signing in with the user account, which will be, Liam at outlook.com, let's say. It's going to then redirect me all the way out to outlook.com to authenticate, and then it will redirect me all the way back, and then I'll be able to access. Similar issue, not quite sure which password. What becomes really confusing here is if an organization, so let's say my company was called companyaa.com, and I didn't have Office 365, but I had created Liam at companyaa.com as a live ID because I was using it for connecting to something else. Now what we suddenly have is a Liam at companyaa.com on-premises account with a password. Then we have Liam at companyaa.com in the Microsoft Live ID infrastructure with a password. And then we have the tenant we're trying to access. That's when it becomes confusing with passwords going backwards and forwards. And then, of course, the last two are the simple ones. We're just doing, password hash synchronization and then authenticating all the way through. Okay, so let's look at one of our last areas for the exam, which is Office 365 workloads and applications. So Microsoft 365 and Office 365 provide deployment advisors or setup guides. Each guide provides step-by-step instructions, resources, articles, and often when needed, scripts that you can use to modify the configuration. These guides provide choices that reflect the specific needs for different sizes of organization. These guides were created using the best practices that the Microsoft Fast Track onboarding specialists have shared as they've gone through the process of deploying Microsoft 365. They give information and product support, enabling security features, deploying collaboration tools, and providing scripts for those kind of more advanced deployments. Obviously, as new guidance comes out, they will update those deployment advisors, those documents, to make them available to you. The Microsoft 365 service is obviously in the cloud. So one of the biggest things that needs validating is, do we have the right bandwidth? Is the network fast enough to suddenly go from downloading my 100 meg spreadsheet from the server in the same office to downloading it from the Microsoft cloud over the internet connection that we have? So Microsoft provide a 365 connectivity test assessment tool that runs a basic connectivity test against 365 tenant and then kind of checks basic performance between there to your end. So the tool highlights any web browsing issues that can impact the door. It'll provide advanced tests using a downloadable Windows 10 application that makes perimeter network design recommendations basically mapped to any kind of proxy servers, firewalls, and DNS servers that you may have in between. The tool also runs performance tests for Skype for Business, Microsoft Teams, SharePoint Online, and Exchange Online. The tool has two different components. It's a browser-based UI that collects connectivity information, and then you have the downloadable Windows 10 application that can run advanced tests and return assessment data. The browser-based tool displays the information broke into two kind of tabs. The first one is results and impact. This is the location on a map of the in-use service front door, so the endpoint at Microsoft 365. Also the location on a map of other service front doors that you could utilize for optimal connectivity. And then it will give you relative performance compared to other 365 customers that Microsoft has that are near you, so other organizations. There's a details and solutions tab, and this will provide the user location by city and country. It'll give you the network egress location by city, state, and country, the user to the network egress distance, the Microsoft 365 Exchange Online service front door location it tested against, the optimal Microsoft Exchange Online service door, and then a mapping against any other Microsoft customers, organizations that are in the same kind of metro area that seem to have better performance. So it will give you the ability to tune your network, increase the bandwidth, or add other capabilities so that you don't have network bottlenecks. Now, there is also a tool set available on GitHub, which will allow you to spin up, for example, a virtual machine in Azure, in Azure, and then run some tests locally. So it will download and upload files backwards and forwards on the virtual machines, and it will give you a better kind of network statistics between the two. Once we've ironed out all of our bandwidth issues and we have the tenant configured and everything's good to go, one of the most critical things that comes next is deploying Office 365 Pro Plus. So deploying Microsoft 365 apps can be done in two different approaches. The first one is to deploy from the cloud, and the second is to deploy from a local source. Now, deploying from the cloud, you'll download the Office deployment tool, which is an application that will allow you to create a configuration that's required for the deployment. You'll then create a folder share for the Office 365 Office installation files, and I just have it as server share M365. You'll then define the configuration file, which is an XML definition of what you want to do as part of that installation, and then you deploy Office. You run the MSI executable, and it will then read the configuration file and deploy what needs to be done. Now, if you're not going to deploy from the cloud, which means you're going to download everything locally, you'll then need to create shared folders for the Office installation. So we have three different folder types. So we have the M365. This stores the Office deployment tool and the configuration files that define how to download and deploy Office. The other two folders have interesting names. One's called SecP, one's called Sec. And this stores the Microsoft 365 apps installation files for the semi-annual enterprise channel preview, which is the first one. So remember, when we push Office out, we obviously need to manage the channels. Are you going to get the new features, the preview features versus people that don't? And then the second folder is really just the semi-annual enterprise channel, the non-preview capabilities. What normally happens at this point is within those two folders, one ends up being for a pilot group, with the version of Office being the preview, so the semi-annual enterprise channel P. And then the other one is the broad group for all of the versions of Office for everybody else. So you're basically building a structure like you would using the content delivery network that Office uses. Once you have that deployment tool and the files deployed, you then create the configuration file, you download the Office installation package that's required, and then you deploy Office utilizing whichever process you want to, whether it's you're using Configuration Manager, on-premises, System Center, or whether you're having them go to the share and double-click and install that way. The critical thing here is the deployment configuration file itself. This is an XML configuration file that will manage the overall installation wizard. You can use this XML file to exclude or remove Microsoft 365 applications from the client machines as part of the install. You can also apply specific application preferences, such as, do I want to show the license agreement as part of the install? Is it going to be a silent install? What's the addition of Office that I need to install? Is it going to be, which language will it be in? Is it going to be English or Spanish or French or German? You control that in the XML definition. Now, I will tell you that if you take the MS-100 and later on the MS-500, this XML definition structure of excluding and including, etc., is covered on the exam. An example configuration here. So, for example, this is a base one where we're installing from the server path. We're installing Office 365 Pro Plus. It's going to be in English. And then I have my accepting the license agreement set to true. So this is a default standard way of doing it. Any products that you wish to add or modify, you pass in the product ID. So if I just grab a pen here, you'll see that I can specify my language right here. So I can add multiple languages at this point. I can then also add multiple products by simply just adding more products to here. You can also then add any of this section where it says display. Anything here is really around the actual definition of the install itself. If we look at another one here, you can see that we have the same configuration. You'll notice a big difference here is I've now got a version number. So I'm targeting a specific version number of the binary installs. So instead of just saying what's there, I'm asking for 15.1.2.3. And then what I'm also doing is saying I want to get English version. And you'll see this one here, where I'm now excluding Publisher from being installed, which also will have the effect of, if it is on that machine, it can actually remove the Publisher application when you run this installer. Now, of course, if you don't want to do that, then you don't exclude them. And if you are, then you just need to let people know that, hey, when you run the install, it's actually going to go ahead and remove those individual applications instead of keeping them there. So understanding how the configuration file works and where that goes and how that applies is critical in deploying the applications. So a knowledge check. What property on the Office 365 Pro Plus configuration file will exclude an application from being installed or remove a specific application? Now, of course, we just looked at that one. So that will be the exclude app, not the remove app, uninstall app, etc. Exclude app will be the one that removes an application or restricts an application from being installed. So if you already have the 365 apps installed, you can then use exclude element to remove that application that was previously installed. So there will be some questions on there that talk about this specifically. Phone, whatever it would be, go to the relative store and download the applications onto the devices. Now, of course, once they're deployed, then the end user just needs to authenticate with their current Office 365 credentials, and they will then gain access to those applications. As far as licenses go, that's not really how this one works. There's just a validation that the user belongs to a tenant, and then those mobile applications exist. Now, of course, you can also deploy those applications using a mobile device management solution. So, for example, if you were using Microsoft Intune in Microsoft 365, then you can obviously push out those applications. They can reside in the company portal application that you would deploy onto the mobile device, and then they can look at the approved applications that are there. Now, of course, the one thing to be aware of is that mobile applications, if they're installed manually, you'll want to do some kind of protection. Now, I don't want to spend too much time talking about this because this will be in MS-101, but you can use mobile application management policies to actually control the flow of the data in and out of those mobile applications. So just be aware, you can either manage them and deploy them using an MDM, doesn't have to be Intune, it can be something else, or you can have them download them manually and then they're able to utilize them at that point. Okay, so to ensure that the test users get access to the preview features of Office 365 Pro Plus, which folder structure should they install from? Now, of course, we looked at our folder structure. We have the M365, M365 SecP, M365 Sec, or M365 Update. In this example, it's obviously going to be our SecP. Now, of course, the most important thing here is you may not have named them that way, but going forward, as you decide to do this, you just need to make sure that you have a folder structure that's built to be able to do that. Now, if I just come out of this for a second, okay, I'm actually going to go here into my tenant. And what I want to do here is actually click on Endpoint Manager, just so you can see some of the components that are available here. Now, Endpoint Manager is the new wrapping up of Microsoft Intune, and it will contain access to conditional access policies, etc. So a couple of things I want to look at here. Before we do this one, I'm just going to flick back to 365 here, the admin center for the users. Now, of course, we talked a little bit earlier, and I meant to go over this earlier, but multi-factor authentication is available directly within the admin center at the user level. And so what this one does is it launches me to the specific section where I can select the users and I can then say enable for multi-factor. So that's the first option. The second option does bring me into Microsoft Endpoint Manager. I can actually get to it a different way too. If I go to Azure Active Directory here and just click, and then if I go down to security, inside security, I can click conditional access. From here, I'm able to define conditional access policies. So if we look at the new policy option for a conditional access policy, I'm just going to put some text in here. I can pick the users. So I'm going to say users and groups, and I'm going to pick a couple of users here and add them in. I'm then going to go to my applications. I'm going to say for all cloud applications. I'm then going to go to a condition. I'm not going to worry about conditions, but what I'm going to do here is say grant and then say require multi-factor authentication. So what I'm able to do here is craft conditional access policies that will allow me to control whether multi-factor authentication is forced or at least requested as part of the authentication process. If the end user already has multi-factor enabled from the previous approach, then that's okay. It will still force it, and the end user will then be able to utilize that. So we can obviously do a combination of things. We also have session control here that I can associate, which will allow me to use persistent browser sessions. I can control the frequency of sign-ins as well as conditional access to block downloads, etc. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that one, the two different approaches, because what that does is when we go into Endpoint Manager and we actually click onto apps on this side, if we are looking at what's called app protection policies, which we would create for those mobile applications that have been deployed, then we would create them here. So we would say create policy. Let's say it's an iOS device. So from here on the iOS device, I'm going to type some values, do next, and then we get to go through and say, I want to target specific applications. So if we'd put Office, so if I just do Office, you can see Microsoft Office here. I'm going to select. I could also then pick specific applications. So if I type Word, you'll see that they come up as well. So just be aware, depending on what you've deployed, whether it's Word or whether they've deployed the Microsoft Office app that does everything, You can then click next, and then I get to provide the capabilities for protection. So I'll be able to say, I don't want anybody copying things between there and that location. And so you can obviously control all of that. Then we can do access requirements, launching, asking for pins, asking for other things around those specific applications. But then more importantly, we get some kind of conditional access approaches. I can then do next for assignments, choose next, and then create, which I'm not going to. But that would create the app protection policy. So when you deployed those applications directly to the mobile devices, or as you can see, even to a Windows 10 device, I then get that flexibility. So if I go back to app protection and just say Windows 10, you'll see that we have two different options. This is important to understand as part of the deployment, that we have what's called with enrollment and without enrollment. Without enrollment is BYOD, so bring your own device. So I can say without enrollment, and then I get to go through the same process again. So if you are deploying Office to Windows 10 devices, or you are deploying Office to mobile devices, then you will end up looking at Microsoft Endpoint Manager, and you will want to control some of those capabilities. But the core focus for the deployment pieces inside the exam will be limited at least to some high-level questions about this, but then most of it will be configuration in the XML definition. Okay, so let me come back to Azure Active Directory and click OK. Okay, so let's go back to the slides. Okay. Let me just do that. Okay. So we crammed everything in that's in there. So we're going to wrap things up. So as you know, here at obviously Skill Me Up and Optility, we do these on-demand training preparation, just cramming as much as we can. So we hope the Exam Cram has helped kind of understand some of the core focuses for MS-100. Don't forget that you have access to, not only the Skill Me Up live resources, but access to all other on-demand training through your existing subscription. Of course, we can help you order and manage certification vouchers, etc., for teams as well. So in summary, we can't stress enough how excited we are for you to take the exam at some point. We hope that the presentation gave you some basic understanding and crammed as much as we could into that time. We obviously went through a quick exam overview. We then ran through each of the core sections. So understanding Microsoft 365 services, understanding user identity and roles, and then also understanding access and authentication, as well as Office 365 workloads and applications. The most key and critical piece of this out of everything is to truly understand authentication, the multi-factor authentication processes, external user, license assignment, especially when it comes to external users, how that license assignment works. And then, of course, understanding Office deployment. Those are the core critical areas. Even though the last section is 10 to 15% of the exam, most of those questions will be around Office deployment and what that is needed. But the rest of it is really around permission, security, Azure AD Connect, definitely around topologies, etc. as well. Okay, so I'm going to leave it open for a second to kind of ask any questions that you want to ask, and we'll leave it going. We still have a little bit of time, so I can give some time back to you. But for now, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. Now, while we're waiting, if you feel like typing, I will be doing another one of these in a week and a bit, I think, which will be MS-500, which is really the logical step from this one. So once you've done MS-100 and MS-101 and kind of moved up, MS-500 is I'm going to call that the big boy exam. It's the one where it's really heavily focused on a lot more of the security capabilities that are available as well. So if you're looking to go that route, then it'd be great to have you on that one too. I think it's about a week and a half from now. Okay, well, if you have no questions, I really appreciate you joining me today, and I hope that it's been helpful for you to be able to go and take the MS-100 exam. If you have any other questions that come up after we drop off this, then reach out to your assigned project manager or your CSA, and we're always looking to improve these kind of sessions that we do. And so let us know if there's things that you think we can do better. Please let us know. But thank you again for joining today, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.